What would you do if you witnessed a massive python attacking an innocent animal, knowing that intervening could cost you your life? For Sarah Martinez, a single mother of two young children living on a small farm in rural Florida, this terrifying scenario became reality on a sweltering August afternoon that would forever change her relationship with the most unlikely ally imaginable. Sarah had moved to the 20-acre property outside Gainesville 3 years earlier, following her divorce from an abusive husband who had left her with nothing but debt and 2 children to raise alone. At 34 years old, she was determined to build a new life for herself and her kids, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Michael, far away from the violence and fear that had dominated their previous existence. The small farm wasn't much to look at when Sarah first purchased it with her life savings and a loan from her sympathetic older brother. The house needed extensive repairs. The fences were falling down, and the previous owner had left behind a handful of cattle that were half wild and completely unmanaged. But Sarah saw potential where others saw problems, and she threw herself into the backbreaking work of restoration with the determination of someone who had no choice but to succeed. Over the past 3 years, Sarah had slowly transformed the neglected property into a functioning farm. She learned to repair fences, tend to sick animals, and manage the small herd of cattle that had become both her livelihood and her passion. The cattle provided milk, which she sold to local dairies, and occasionally she would sell a young bull to neighboring ranchers to help pay the bills. Among her small herd was an impressive Brahma bull named Titan, who had established himself as the undisputed leader of the group. Standing nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing over 2,000 pounds, Titan was a magnificent specimen with distinctive gray coloring and the characteristic hump that marked his breed. Despite his intimidating size and the natural aggressiveness typical of breeding bulls, Titan had never shown any hostility towards Sarah or her children. In fact, Sarah had noticed that Titan seemed unusually protective of her family. When strangers visited the farm, the massive bull would position himself between the visitors and Sarah's children, watching carefully until he was satisfied that no threat existed. The children adored him, and despite Sarah's constant warnings about maintaining a respectful distance from such a powerful animal, they had developed an unusual bond with the gentle giant. On the afternoon that would test this bond in ways Sarah never could have imagined, she was working in the vegetable garden behind the house, while Emma and Michael played in the nearby yard. The August heat was oppressive, with temperatures reaching the mid-90s and humidity that made the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah had been looking forward to finishing her work and retreating to the air-conditioned house when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the normal lowing of cattle or the rustle of wind through the oak trees that dotted her property. It was a sound of distress, a deep, panicked bellowing that she had never heard from any of her animals before. The sound was coming from the direction of the main pasture, where Titan and the other cattle typically spent their afternoons grazing in whatever shade they could find. "Kids, stay right here and don't move," Sarah called to Emma and Michael as she grabbed a heavy stick from the woodpile and began running toward the source of the commotion. Her heart was pounding as various scenarios raced through her mind. Perhaps one of the cattle had gotten injured, or maybe a neighbor's dog had gotten into the pasture and was harassing the herd. Nothing could have prepared her for what she saw when she reached the fence line and looked into the pasture. About 50 yards away, near the pond that provided water for the cattle, Titan was engaged in a life-or-death struggle with the largest snake Sarah had ever seen. The massive python, easily 20 feet long and as thick as a telephone pole, had wrapped itself around the bull's powerful neck and was attempting to constrict his breathing. Titan was fighting for his life, thrashing violently and trying to shake off the enormous serpent, but the python's grip was unrelenting. The bull's bellowing had taken on a desperate quality that spoke of exhaustion and growing panic. Sarah could see that Titan's movements were becoming weaker as the snake's coils tightened around his throat, cutting off his air supply. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen with shock and terror. Pythons weren't native to Florida, but she knew that invasive species had been spotted throughout the state in recent years, and this specimen was clearly large enough to kill a full-grown bull. The logical part of her mind screamed at her to run back to the house, call for help, and hope that Titan could hold on until animal control arrived. But as she watched the magnificent bull who had become such an important part of her family's life slowly losing his battle against the massive predator, Sarah felt something deeper than logic take over. This bull had protected her children, had been gentle and patient with her family when he could have easily been dangerous, and had become a symbol of the new life she was trying to build. "I'm not going to let you die," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination as she climbed through the fence and began walking toward the deadly struggle. Sarah knew that what she was about to attempt was incredibly dangerous. Pythons were capable of crushing bones and could easily kill a human being, especially one who was trying to interfere with their feeding process. But she also knew that she couldn't stand by and watch while an animal that had become part of her family was slowly strangled to death. As she approached the fighting animals, Sarah tried to remember everything she had ever read or heard about dealing with large snakes. She knew that pythons killed by constriction rather than venom, which meant that if she could somehow break the snake's grip on Titan's neck, the bull might have a chance to escape. But she also knew that getting close enough to help would put her own life in immediate danger. The python seemed to sense her approach and turned its massive head toward her, its cold eyes reflecting an ancient intelligence that sent chills down Sarah's spine. For a moment, the snake seemed to consider whether this new threat was worth abandoning its current prey, but ultimately, it tightened its coils around Titan's neck and continued its deadly work. Sarah raised the heavy stick she had brought from the woodpile and approached the snake from behind, hoping to deliver a blow that might force it to release its grip. But as she drew closer, she realized that the python was even larger than she had initially thought, and that her improvised weapon was pitifully inadequate for the task at hand. Titan's struggles were growing weaker, and Sarah could see that time was running out. The bull's eyes, normally bright and alert, were beginning to glaze over as oxygen deprivation took its toll. In that moment, looking into the eyes of the animal that had protected her family, Sarah made a decision that defied every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. She dropped the stick and reached out with her bare hands to grab the python's massive coils, hoping against hope that she could somehow pry them loose before it was too late for both her and Titan. The moment Sarah's hands made contact with the python's muscular coils, she understood why people said these creatures were among nature's most formidable predators. The snake's body felt like a steel cable wrapped in leather, impossibly strong and completely unyielding to her desperate attempts to pry it loose from Titan's throat. The python's skin was surprisingly warm and dry, not the slimy texture she had expected, but the sheer power contained within those coils was unlike anything she had ever encountered. As Sarah struggled to find some way to break the snake's death grip, the python suddenly shifted its attention to this new threat. With lightning speed that belied its massive size, the rear portion of the snake's body whipped around and struck Sarah in the chest, sending her flying backward through the air. She landed hard on her back, the wind knocked out of her lungs, and for a terrifying moment she couldn't breathe or move. The python had not released its grip on Titan, but now it was also focused on Sarah as a potential threat to be eliminated. She could see the snake's massive head turning toward her, its forked tongue flicking out to taste the air and assess this new enemy. Sarah had never felt so vulnerable in her life as she struggled to get back on her feet, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether she lived or died. But even as terror threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah's determination only grew stronger. She thought of Emma and Michael back at the house, probably wondering why their mother hadn't returned from checking on the cattle. She thought of all the evenings when Titan had stood guard while her children played in the yard, his massive presence a source of comfort and security in their new life. This bull had given her family protection and peace of mind, and now it was her turn to return that gift. Before we continue with this incredible story of courage and the shocking response it would inspire, I need to ask you for something that would mean the world to me. If you're amazed by Sarah's bravery and you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happens next, please take just 1 second to hit that like button below. Your support helps these incredible true stories reach more people who need to hear them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell, because what happens next between Sarah and this massive bull will restore your faith in the bonds that can form between humans and animals. Trust me when I tell you that Titan's response to Sarah's sacrifice will leave you speechless. Now, let's get back to Sarah and the fight for Titan's life. Sarah scrambled to her feet and grabbed a larger piece of dead wood that had fallen from one of the oak trees. This time, instead of trying to pry the snake loose, she began striking it repeatedly on the head and neck area, hoping to disorient or injure it enough to make it release its prey. The impacts made solid thudding sounds, but the python seemed barely affected by her assault. Worse yet, her attacks had definitely gotten the snake's attention. With a portion of its body still wrapped around Titan's neck, the python began to extend towards Sarah, its massive head weaving back and forth as it prepared to strike. Sarah had seen enough nature documentaries to know that pythons typically killed their prey by constriction, but she also knew they had powerful jaws filled with razor-sharp teeth that could inflict devastating injuries. Just as the snake's head darted toward her with incredible speed, Sarah threw herself to the side, feeling the rush of air as the python's jaws snapped shut inches from her face. She rolled away and came up running, but she knew she couldn't keep dodging the snake's attacks indefinitely. Titan's struggles were growing weaker, and she could see that the bull was losing consciousness as the python's coils cut off his air supply. In desperation, Sarah remembered something she had read about snake behavior. Most large constrictors were ambush predators that relied on surprise and overwhelming force to subdue their prey quickly. Once they committed to an attack, they were often reluctant to release their grip unless they felt genuinely threatened or believed their own lives were in danger. Acting on pure instinct and the kind of desperate creativity that emerges in life-or-death situations, Sarah began shouting at the top of her lungs while waving her arms wildly above her head. She made herself appear as large and threatening as possible, hoping to convince the python that she represented a serious danger to its survival. The effect was immediate and remarkable. The python's head stopped weaving and turned to focus entirely on Sarah, clearly recognizing her as a significant threat. But instead of releasing Titan to deal with her, the snake made a tactical error that would prove to be its downfall. The python began to uncoil some of its length from around Titan's neck in order to extend toward Sarah, apparently believing it could subdue both the bull and the human simultaneously. As soon as the pressure around his throat lessened, Titan's survival instincts kicked in with explosive force. The massive bull, who had been growing weaker by the second, suddenly found himself able to breathe again. With a bellow of rage that echoed across the entire farm, Titan surged to his feet and began a counterattack that was both terrifying and magnificent to witness. Using his incredible strength and the natural weapons that nature had given him, Titan began to shake his massive head violently, trying to dislodge the remaining coils of the python from around his neck. His powerful hooves struck the ground with such force that Sarah could feel the vibrations through the soles of her boots, and his eyes blazed with a fury that made clear he was no longer the victim in this encounter. The python, suddenly finding itself caught between an enraged bull and a determined human, seemed to realize that it had made a serious miscalculation. But snakes of this size don't change strategies quickly, and the python's commitment to its original attack plan gave Titan the opening he needed. With a motion so swift it was almost impossible to follow, Titan lowered his massive head and drove one of his horns directly into the python's midsection. The impact was devastating, and the snake's grip on the bull's neck loosened immediately as it tried to coil around this new source of pain. But Titan wasn't finished. Years of evolution had made him a formidable fighter when threatened, and now that he was free to use his full strength, the python was no longer the aggressor in this encounter. The bull began to trample and gore the snake with a methodical fury that left no doubt about the outcome of the battle. Sarah stood transfixed, watching as the bull she had risked her life to save systematically destroyed the creature that had nearly killed them both. But what happened next would shock her even more than the violence of the fight itself. As the python's movements grew weaker and finally stopped altogether, Titan turned his attention to Sarah. The massive bull, still breathing heavily from his ordeal and covered in mud and snake blood, began walking slowly toward the woman who had saved his life. Sarah's heart began racing again as 2,000 pounds of bull approached her, and she suddenly realized that she had no idea how Titan might react to what had just occurred. Bulls were notoriously unpredictable animals, especially after violent encounters, and there was no telling whether Titan would see her as a friend or a threat. But as the magnificent bull drew closer, Sarah saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. It wasn't anger or aggression or the wild fury that had driven his attack on the python. It was something that looked remarkably like gratitude, recognition, and a depth of understanding that seemed impossible in an animal. Titan stopped just a few feet away from Sarah and lowered his massive head, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, in a gesture that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about cattle behavior, the bull gently pressed his forehead against her chest and held it there, as if acknowledging the debt he owed to the brave woman who had risked everything to save his life. As Titan's final powerful blow connected with the massive python, the severely injured serpent realized that its ambush had turned into a fight for survival it could not win. The snake, bleeding from multiple wounds inflicted by the bull's horns and hooves, began desperately trying to disengage from the battle. With surprising speed for such a massive creature, the python released its remaining grip on Titan and began slithering rapidly toward the dense vegetation at the edge of the pasture. Sarah watched in amazement as the 20-foot predator that had seemed so terrifyingly powerful just minutes before now fled in defeat, its body moving in erratic, pained motions as it sought refuge in the tall grass and palmetto bushes that bordered her property. The python was clearly severely injured and barely alive, leaving a trail of blood as it disappeared into the wilderness, where it would likely die from its wounds or fall prey to other predators. Titan made no move to pursue the retreating snake. Instead, the massive bull stood his ground, his sides heaving from exertion and adrenaline, watching until the python completely disappeared from view. Only then did he turn his attention back to Sarah, and what she saw in his eyes made her knees weak with emotion. The bull's gaze held an intelligence and awareness that seemed almost human in its depth. As Titan slowly approached her, Sarah felt no fear despite his imposing size and the violence she had just witnessed. There was something in his demeanor that spoke of gentleness and recognition, as if he understood exactly what she had done and why she had done it. When Titan reached her, he lowered his massive head and gently pressed his forehead against Sarah's chest, holding the position for several long moments. The gesture was so unexpected and so clearly intentional that Sarah found herself overcome with emotion. She reached up with trembling hands and touched the bull's face, feeling the warmth of his breath and the incredible power contained within his muscular frame. "You're okay," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. "We're both okay." Titan seemed to understand her words, or at least the tone of comfort and reassurance in her voice. He nuzzled against her shoulder briefly before stepping back and looking toward the house where Emma and Michael were waiting. It was as if he was reminding her that she needed to return to her children and assure them that everything was safe. The walk back to the house felt surreal to Sarah. Her entire body was shaking from the adrenaline crash, and she was acutely aware of how close she had come to being killed by the massive python. But she was also filled with a sense of profound connection to the bull who walked beside her, occasionally brushing against her arm as if to reassure himself that she was really there and unharmed. Emma and Michael came running from the house the moment they saw their mother approaching. Their faces showed the worry and fear they had experienced during the 30 minutes she had been gone, and Sarah realized that her clothes were torn and muddy, clear evidence that something serious had happened. "Mommy, what happened?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old eyes wide with concern. "We heard Titan making scary noises, and you were gone so long." Sarah knelt down and pulled both children into her arms, holding them tightly as she tried to process everything that had just occurred. How could she explain to her young children that she had just battled a giant snake to save their beloved bull? How could she make them understand the life-or-death struggle that had taken place just a few hundred yards from where they had been playing? "There was a big snake that was hurting Titan," Sarah said carefully, choosing her words to convey the seriousness of the situation without terrifying her children. "But Titan is very strong, and he fought it off. The snake is gone now, and everyone is safe." Michael, who was 6 and had always been fascinated by animals, looked up at Titan with new respect. "Titan fought a snake? Like a superhero?" Sarah smiled despite her exhaustion. "Yes, exactly like a superhero. Titan was very brave." But even as she reassured her children, Sarah found herself looking back at Titan with growing amazement. The bull had positioned himself between her family and the direction where the python had disappeared, his alert posture making it clear that he was standing guard. It was protective behavior that went far beyond normal cattle instincts, and Sarah began to understand that the events of the afternoon had created something special between them. Over the following days, Sarah noticed dramatic changes in Titan's behavior toward her and her children. The bull, who had always been gentle but somewhat aloof, now seemed to consider himself their personal guardian. When Sarah worked in the garden, Titan would graze nearby, always positioning himself where he could see both her and the children. When strangers visited the farm, the bull's protective instincts became even more pronounced. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the local veterinarian who came to examine Titan for injuries from his battle with the python, was amazed by what she observed. "I've been treating cattle for 15 years, she told Sarah as she watched Titan stand calmly while she checked him over. "But I've never seen a bull behave like this. He's watching your every move, and he seems to understand that you're under his protection." The examination revealed that Titan had suffered only minor injuries from his encounter with the python, some scratches and bruises, but nothing that wouldn't heal quickly. The bull's thick hide and powerful musculature had protected him from serious harm, and his quick thinking and using Sarah's distraction to break free had saved both their lives. But the most remarkable change wasn't in Titan's physical condition. It was in the relationship that had developed between the bull and Sarah's family. Emma and Michael, who had always loved Titan from a distance, now found themselves with a gentle giant who seemed genuinely invested in their well-being. When Michael fell off his bicycle and scraped his knee badly enough to cry, Titan came running from across the pasture to investigate the commotion. The bull stood nearby while Sarah cleaned and bandaged the wound, his presence seeming to comfort the injured boy. When Emma was frightened by a thunderstorm one evening, she ran to the fence that separated the yard from the pasture, and Titan immediately approached to stand near her until the storm passed. The local community began to take notice of the unusual bond that had developed at Sarah's farm. Word spread about the mother who had risked her life to save a bull from a giant python, and about the remarkable behavior the bull had displayed ever since. Neighbors who had previously viewed Titan as just another piece of livestock now spoke of him with respect and wonder. "That bull knows what you did for him," said Tom Rodriguez, Sarah's nearest neighbor and a lifelong cattle rancher. "I've been working with cattle for 40 years and I've never seen anything like the way he watches over your family. It's like he's appointed himself as your bodyguard." Sarah had to agree with Tom's assessment. Titan's behavior had evolved from simple protective instincts to something that seemed almost supernatural in its consistency and intelligence. The bull appeared to understand routines, anticipate potential dangers, and respond to the emotional states of her children in ways that amazed everyone who witnessed it. But perhaps the most touching aspect of their new relationship was the quiet moments Sarah and Titan shared together. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Sarah would often walk out to the pasture fence, and Titan would approach for what had become their ritual of mutual recognition and gratitude. During these peaceful encounters, Sarah would speak softly to the massive bull about her day, her concerns for her children, and her hopes for their future on the farm. Titan would listen with apparent attention, occasionally nuzzling her arm or making soft sounds that seemed almost conversational in nature. "I know you understand me," Sarah would tell him during these evening talks. "I know you remember what we went through together, and I want you to know that I would do it again in a heartbeat. You're part of our family now, in a way that goes deeper than I ever thought possible." As if in response to her words, Titan would often press his massive forehead against the fence where Sarah stood, recreating the gesture of gratitude and connection that had marked the beginning of their extraordinary bond. It was a relationship that defied conventional understanding of human-animal interactions, but Sarah had learned that some connections transcend the normal boundaries between species. The python attack had been a terrifying experience that could have ended in tragedy for both Sarah and Titan. Instead, it had created a bond of mutual respect, protection, and affection that enriched the lives of everyone on the small farm, and proved that courage and compassion could forge connections that seemed almost magical in their depth and meaning. 2 years after the python attack, the extraordinary bond between Sarah's family and Titan had not only endured but had grown stronger with each passing day. What had begun as a moment of desperate courage in the face of mortal danger had evolved into a relationship that challenged everything the local community thought they knew about the intelligence and emotional capacity of farm animals. Titan's protective instincts had become legendary in the area surrounding Gainesville. The massive bull seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense potential threats to Sarah and her children, often positioning himself to intercept danger before the humans were even aware it existed. Local wildlife officials had documented several instances where Titan had deterred aggressive wild animals from approaching the farm, including black bears, wild boars, and even an alligator that had wandered up from a nearby swamp. The most remarkable incident occurred on a humid September evening when 10-year-old Emma was playing in the yard while Sarah prepared dinner inside the house. A large black bear, probably attracted by the smell of garbage from a neighbor's improperly secured trash can, had wandered onto the property and was approaching the area where Emma was playing with her dolls. Emma, focused on her game and unaware of the approaching danger, didn't notice the bear until it was less than 30 feet away. But Titan, who had been grazing on the far side of the pasture, somehow sensed the threat and came charging across the field with a speed that seemed impossible for such a massive animal. The bull positioned himself directly between Emma and the bear, lowering his head and making deep, threatening sounds that left no doubt about his intentions. The bear, apparently recognizing that it was facing a formidable opponent, quickly decided that whatever it had been seeking wasn't worth a confrontation with an enraged bull. It retreated into the forest without incident, but the message was clear. Titan would not tolerate any threat to the children he had appointed himself to protect. When Sarah came running out of the house after hearing the commotion, She found Emma sitting safely in the yard while Titan stood guard nearby, his alert posture making it clear that he would remain vigilant until he was certain the danger had passed. The incident reinforced what Sarah had come to understand about her unlikely protector. Titan was no longer just a bull on her farm, he was a member of her family in every way that mattered. Dr. Chen, who had become fascinated by Titan's behavior and had begun documenting his protective instincts for a research paper on animal cognition, was amazed by the consistency and intelligence of his responses. What Titan is displaying goes far beyond normal cattle behavior, she explained to Sarah during one of her regular visits. He's showing planning, anticipation, and decision-making abilities that suggest a level of consciousness we don't typically associate with farm animals. The veterinarian's research had attracted attention from animal behaviorists at the University of Florida, who requested permission to study Titan's unique characteristics. Sarah agreed to limited observation, but only on the condition that it not interfere with the bull's normal routine or cause him any stress. The researchers were amazed by what they observed. Titan displays protective behaviors typically associated with highly intelligent mammals like elephants or primates, explained Dr. Maria Santos, the lead researcher on the project. He seems to have formed emotional attachments to specific humans and will risk his own safety to protect them. This level of interspecies bonding is extremely rare and suggests that we may need to reconsider our understanding of bovine intelligence. But for Sarah and her children, Titan's intelligence wasn't a subject for academic study. It was a daily reality that enriched their lives in countless ways. Michael, now 8 years old, had developed a particularly close relationship with the gentle giant. The boy had been born with mild autism, and his mother had worried about his difficulty forming social connections. But with Titan, Michael found a patient, non-judgmental companion who seemed to understand his need for routine and predictability. Every afternoon after school, Michael would sit by the pasture fence and talk to Titan about his day, sharing his frustrations and successes with the massive bull who listened with apparent attention and understanding. Titan never interrupted, never judged, and never failed to approach when Michael called for him. The relationship had helped Michael develop confidence and communication skills that amazed his teachers and therapists. Emma, now 12, and approaching the challenging teenage years, had also found comfort in her relationship with Titan. When school bullies teased her about living on a farm or made fun of her hand-me-down clothes, she would seek out Titan's calm presence. The bull seemed to sense her emotional state and would offer the kind of silent support that helped her navigate the complexities of adolescence. Titan understands us better than most people do, Emma told her mother one evening as they watched the bull graze peacefully in the pasture. He never makes me feel stupid or different. He just accepts us the way we are. Sarah had to agree with her daughter's assessment. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, Titan represented something pure and constant, a love that was given freely without expectation of anything in return except the opportunity to protect and serve. The financial benefits of Titan's presence had also become apparent over time. Word of the protective bull had spread throughout the region, and Sarah found herself fielding inquiries from other farmers who wanted to breed their cows to him. The fees from these breeding services had significantly improved her family's financial situation, allowing her to make improvements to the farm and ensure a more secure future for her children. But perhaps more importantly, Titan's story had inspired others in the community to look more carefully at the animals in their own lives. Several neighbors had begun paying closer attention to the personalities and behaviors of their livestock, discovering individual characteristics and intelligence they had previously overlooked. Tom Rodriguez, Sarah's neighbor who had been ranching for 4 decades, made changes to his own operation after witnessing Titan's remarkable behavior. "I used to think cattle were just cattle," he told Sarah. "But watching Titan has made me realize that each animal is an individual with their own personality and capabilities. I treat my herd differently now, and I swear they respond better because of it." The local community had embraced Titan as something of a celebrity, and his story had been featured in regional newspapers and farming magazines. Visitors would sometimes stop by the farm hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous protective bull, though Sarah was careful to limit these interactions to ensure Titan's stress levels remained low. As Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her family to this point, she was struck by how much their lives had been enriched by the bond they shared with Titan. What had begun as a split-second decision to risk her life for an animal in distress had evolved into a relationship that provided security, companionship, and love for her entire family. On quiet evenings, when the children were doing homework and the farm was peaceful, Sarah would often walk out to the pasture fence for her ritual conversation with Titan. The massive bull would approach immediately, as if he had been waiting for her, and they would share a few moments of silent communication that needed no words. "Thank you," Sarah would whisper as she touched Titan's massive forehead, recreating the gesture that had marked the beginning of their extraordinary bond. "Thank you for protecting my children, for being part of our family, and for showing us that love comes in all different forms." Titan's response was always the same, a gentle nuzzle against her hand and a soft rumbling sound that seemed to say he understood. In a world full of uncertainty and challenge, their bond represented something eternal and unbreakable. Sarah had saved Titan's life in a moment of crisis, but in return, he had given her family something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that they were protected, loved, and never alone. The python attack that could have ended in tragedy had instead created a love story that would last a lifetime. It was proof that courage, compassion, and the willingness to risk everything for another living being could create connections that transcend the normal boundaries between species and touch the very essence of what it means to truly care for another soul. Titan had become more than a guardian. He was family, friend, and living testament to the truth that the most profound relationships often emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. For Sarah and her children, he would always be the gentle giant who proved that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that the strongest bonds are forged not in comfort, but in the crucible of shared danger and mutual sacrifice. Mother of 2 children risks her life to save bull from python. What the alpha bull did left her shocked.